Welcome to Off the Page, the show where we talk with Colorado authors to get the story behind the story. I'm Stacy McKenzie at Mamie Dowd Eisenhower Public Library in Broomfield, and I'm so happy to have author Sharon Mann with me today. Hi Sharon, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being on the show. We have a wide range of what we're going to talk about today. Tessera is the main book that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But first, you are a professional author. This is what you've done for quite a while. Tell me about your career as an author.
Okay. My first paid writing assignment was in 1978. I started by writing Sunday school curriculum for David C. Cook Publishing, and that's what really kicked off my writing career. After that, I continued to seek assignments. And so I've always done what would be called commercial work or work for hire. In other words, I was not writing on spec, so I didn't really call myself a freelance writer, even though I was not necessarily an employee. But I would write on assignment. If I didn't have an assignment, I was not necessarily looking to write something, although sometimes I did. But I always wanted to write my own stuff. And because when you're writing on assignment, you get a very specific assignment. They say this number of pages, this is your audience, this is why you're writing it, and so on. I have done hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. My portfolio has just gotten so big I've stopped adding to it. But these are all articles that don't have a byline, so my name isn't on them. It's run the gamut from advertising to marketing material to trade show material to press releases. And then this also included stints as an employee, as working for publishing companies, working in, I was the global director of corporate communications for a software company. So my master's degree is in communication, so there was always a communication component as well. In other words, planning the communication plan for companies. So that's pretty much what I did as a career, and then on the side, I write all day and then I write all night. My hobby is writing, which you can imagine is very challenging, because after being in front of a computer all day, you might not necessarily feel like continuing to work on your own writing in the evening. But it's always been my passion to follow my heart and write my own stories.
Well, I'm glad you got to, finally. One more thing to touch on with your previous career as a writer. You did some ghost writing, and that sounds interesting to me. Tell me what ghost writing is and how you went about that.
Okay. I think it's probably a little more glamorous for people that have the opportunity to ghost write for famous celebrities and so on. Unfortunately, that's not the kind that I did. I wrote probably 72 blogs, and they were for professionals, so mostly for attorneys that have professional blogs. So pretty dull stuff, and again, it was on assignment. So it was a lot of good work, but not so as exciting as you might think.
Okay, yeah, because ghostwriting does sound very exciting.
Yeah.
But maybe not always.
Well, it isn't in the sense that you usually sign a confidentiality agreement and you can't say who you're writing about.
Yes. So your name again doesn't show up
It doesn't
anywhere.
show up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a hard life.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let's talk a little bit about Tessera.
Okay.
It is a collection of short stories. So why did you decide to go with a collection of short stories instead of a full-length novel? You have a novel, we'll talk about it a little bit, but for this book, why short stories?
Well, I did not set out to write a collection.
Okay.
I started out, I love short fiction. And I think most people do. I think we all remember when we first were exposed to a short story in school and how fun it was to read O. Henry and get that surprise ending. And you know, most people say, yeah, I really love short fiction. So I love it, and I think it's a very challenging form, and I personally consider it the perfect form. I think it's very, very hard. And I like to challenge myself with that. It's a great place to learn craft, to do short stories. It's a great way to practice the craft elements like point of view and scene and dialogue and all of those literary things. And I feel like short fiction, and I am quoting Barbara Kingsolver, that it is large truths in small spaces. And I really like the challenge of the economy, and you have to be very concise and very economical with your words. So it's a challenge, and I like that challenge. So I like the form. So when I started, I think the first one in this, I started about 12, maybe 13 years ago. So it's not a fast process to write a short story. And the first one, I was in Robert McBraerty, who's a well-known virtuoso short story writer here in Colorado, and taking a class at CU. And it started there. It was one of our assignments, and it literally took, that was the longest one. It probably took me until this book, just before this book was published. It was first published in Rosslyn. And so that story started then. The stories happened in various ways. The collection came about a year ago when I realized that I had one published in the anthology by Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, in Rosslyn, and in Progenitor. These were all juried anthologies, which means it's not easy to get into them. So that's meaningful in the sense that these stories have merit. Somebody else has decided, besides me, somebody else has decided that they have merit. But I also realized that my family really wouldn't necessarily know where all these pieces were if anything happened to me. And I thought, you know, I've got other stories. I think I'm just going to aggregate them into a collection and maybe just in a notebook and give it to them for Christmas. So I started to do that. I thought, well, I'll just look at these self-publishing things, you know, these organizations, and I'll just publish 2 to 10 and give them away for Christmas presents. So I polished and got the whole thing all ready, and I was really just about to pull the trigger on that. And I realized I had never sent this off to a publisher to see if anybody was interested. So at that point, I looked at the Colorado Book Awards and who the publishers were that had been in the Colorado Book Awards the previous year. And there was a Colorado publisher called Alacrity House Publishing, and they had a winner or a finalist in that previous year. And I looked at them and I said, you know, this is a perfect fit. They're a Colorado publisher. They're actually in southern Colorado, which is very unusual. Most of my stories are set in southern Colorado. So I felt that there would be a good affinity between my tastes and my writing and what they might be interested in doing. So I sent it off to them, and I got a phone call within 3 weeks. This is not your normal publishing schedule by any means. And my dream, as I mentioned, was to, this was June, my dream was to have this done by Christmas.
Right. Christmas had to wait, right?
Yes. Well, when you're working with a publisher, I realized that it was going to be a completely different timetable. But they liked the idea. When they called me, they said, you know what, we love that idea. Let's get it out. And so the fact that I had worked so hard and they were so highly polished meant that it really cut down on that editing cycle. And we had it out by November 4th.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's rare. All of these things are pretty rare.
Yeah, it was an unusual story.
But you have a long publishing career, so
Yeah,
I guess you're going to have something different maybe happen with all those stories. So Tessera.
Yes.
Tell me about the title of this book. What is a tessera, and how does it fit with the book?
Okay. Tessera is the plural of tessera, which is a Latin word for small tiles. I'm also a mosaic artist, and I really liked that sense that each of these stories was like an individual tile, and that we were putting them together into a new piece of art. Yeah. This book is a new piece of art that's different than the stories individually. And I liked that I just thought that was an apt metaphor. I think the publisher did a beautiful job with the cover. I was really thrilled with it. Because it represents, the turquoise is, if you get close enough, is actually veined turquoise. It's just not a solid field. It represents stone, so it was consistent with that mosaic theme. And then all of the individual pieces in that heart that make, and one of the stories is called Cowboy Heart. So there's a sense that this is very fitting. And then you'll notice that there are also little images, little icons on some of those individual tiles. Those represent the individual stories. And so the icons that you see on the cover correspond in the table of contents with a particular story, and then it's at the top of each chapter head as well. And so I think the publisher did a beautiful job with that, and it did win a merit award from the Colorado Independent Publishers Association, and that award really belongs to the, well, it's for the book, but it was Alacrity House that submitted it, so it's their award.
Ah, yeah. Oh, very nice of you to say that. Which they wouldn't have had that award without you,
well,
but very, very nice of them to say it, and because they work with you so well.
Yes. Oh, they were wonderful.
Yeah, that's marvelous. So short stories. Which do you have favorites in this book of short stories?
Well, that's kind of like asking if you have a favorite child.
I was gonna say, is it like that? Sure.
I don't know if I can point to a favorite. I think the reader favorites are pockets, because it's very short. It's flash fiction. It has a little twist at the end that people don't see coming. And so I think Pockets probably would be the reader favorite, number one. Knife River Flint won the award last year. Well, Pockets won an award from Colorado Authors League 2 years ago, and Knife River Flint won an award this year. It was competing against Cowboy Heart. Oh. So all I can say is I'll let the readers decide if the judges got that right. But I think that Cowboy Heart, I relate very well to Gus, the main character. And he's gritty and real and simple and misguided. And I can just relate to all of that.
And is that how you write? How do you get your ideas? Things you can relate to? Do you develop something within yourself into a character? A lot of writers struggle with this. What do you do?
Yeah, I struggle probably with the opposite problem. I have yellow stickies everywhere with ideas. I have electronic files. I have hard copy files of all of the things that I would love to write. And so I think what is more important is just listening very intently to that creative spirit that will tell me what is going to resonate with other people. Because I really think that's what art, any art form, whether it's music or writing, it's that mimetic form of imitating truth that people can relate to. So what resonates with a reader? What is poignant? What touches them? What's going to make them cry? What's going to make them turn the page? And so because of that, some ideas are fleeting, in the sense that I might have an idea for a book, but it's not really sustainable. So I kind of mine that out and figure out what is going to be sustainable for a short story or for a novel, what people will want to live with, and what I'm going to want to live with while I write, because you have to stick with it and make it come to an end. So.
Yeah. Okay, and I have to ask on a personal note, as a writer, a struggling writer, those ideas you mine out for one story, do you save those for another story, or do you just let them go? How does that work for you?
That's a good question. I think, you know, there is always kind of that stuff that you are letting go, and it might emerge someplace else. It's possible. I feel like all of this is a mosaic where you're picking up the pieces of incidents that have occurred to you in your life and putting it together with other things you've seen, and you're creating new art. So you may pick up a discarded piece. You may pick up a character. And you may have a highly developed character that's got to go out of one book, and you take that character and
pop them into another.
Right.
Well, I have to ask you about Pockets.
Okay.
This was the sweetest story.
Oh,
I
thank
just loved it, and it was created such wonderful visuals. We won't give too much away, but you mentioned it's flash fiction. And so tell me about flash fiction.
Flash fiction is generally considered, you know, people differ a little bit, but I would say under 1,000 words. That's very short. If you enter certain contests or certain publications, they may say 850 or 500 or 200. So, you know, there's flash fiction, which is under 200. When I first wrote this story, I used the organizing principle of lists. And I think you've read it, so you've seen how that works out in the story. But when I created the story, my first draft was about 1,850 words. And I thought, you know what? I mean, and this is something I do, and I would encourage any writer to do it. I'm always practicing craft. I'm always working on, for example, point of view and writing it. I'll write a whole draft and then change the point of view and rewrite it from somebody else's point of view just to see what works. In this case, I really wanted to see if I could improve it by cutting it down and getting it under 1,000 words. So that's almost 50% of the story. Yes. And so I did, and with every word I cut, I really feel that the story got better and better and better. And it's very terse, it's very concise. And I think that it was worth doing that exercise to see if I could do it. Yeah. And it turned into something better than the original product.
Wow. How many times would you say you rewrote it or edited it, or, I mean?
That one came pretty quickly. Okay, but yeah, I mean, it's work. I polish and polish and polish. One of the things I would encourage aspiring writers to do is to focus on craft. Yeah. One of the things that I find really disturbing when I go to writers' conferences is how people will line up to talk to a publisher or an agent or something like that, or they'll go to the classes on how to sell or how to market, yeah, but they don't go to the craft classes. And it's like, learn the craft. That's my #1 tip for aspiring writers.
And are you saying that because then the other things will come?
The other things will come.
Okay, that's what I was hoping you would say.
The other things will come, yeah.
That's good, and it's okay if these things take a long time.
If you want to be a writer, they should.
Yeah.
You know, I really feel like all writers should aspire to putting the very, very best out there.
Now I want to talk about Mother of Exiles, your novel. It's a wonderful novel. Tell me all about this, how this story came to be.
The novel actually came about because I volunteered to be a pen pal with an inmate in a correctional facility in Wisconsin. And as I got to know this woman through our correspondence, and as you can imagine, this was not a chronological story in the correspondence. It was, you know, just bits and pieces and fits and starts, and it did make me think a lot about what she was living through and what she was experiencing. And, you know, she claimed that she had been wrongfully convicted, and that's a pretty common claim among incarcerated individuals. But it's also a disturbing claim, and it's something that terrifies me, and that was something that I felt would resonate with anyone, to be incarcerated for something that they didn't do. What a horrifying, horrifying thing. And so I just felt that there was real potential for creating a character who had been wrongfully convicted and telling that story. And yet then I had to go through the process of saying, but who best to tell the story? And I had to work that out, and I needed a sympathetic character. I didn't want it to be the inmate. You know, the first thing that comes to mind would be a guard, but I needed something more sympathetic than a guard. And so I chose a female chaplain in this correctional facility, and she took on a life of her own. And so I'll leave it to the reader to decide whether the Mother of Exiles is the incarcerated individual or if it's the female chaplain.
Oh, wow. I was so happy to see that you'd written a novel, because I wanted to ask, what different, besides time and the amount of words, what different techniques go into writing a novel versus a short story?
Typically, I would say that the longer form is a little more plot-based, because you really need to be keeping your reader's attention. The shorter form can be more character-driven. Now that is the distinction kind of between literary fiction and commercial fiction. But even if you're writing long literary fiction, you have to have some kind of story structure. And so there's a lot more plotting involved in the longer form.
And so, which do you prefer?
Well, I feel like that's a trick question.
It's really not.
I know it's not.
But maybe I think I know what you'll say.
I do love the short stories. I do love the short stories, but I don't think it will preclude me from continuing to write novels. I feel like it's dependent on that right thing, that thing inside of you that tells you this can be told succinctly, this needs to be developed. You know, just comes down to that.
So short stories, you often classify them, or in libraries we even put them in a different area than other fiction. It's literary fiction. Tell us a little bit about what literary fiction, that classification means it's different, and do you think that's the right classification for this?
Yes, that was the code, the BISEC code that was on the Tessera. Literary fiction, as I mentioned briefly, tends to be more character-driven, and the focus is more on being literature rather than being commercial. So when you think of commercial fiction, you think of genre fiction, so you think of something that conforms to the conventions of that genre. So that would be a Western, a mystery, crime, thrillers, romance, all of those. And typically, writers of commercial fiction, and I say this without a shred of I have no ill feelings about that, because I hope to write commercial fiction as well. But they are conforming to those conventions to sell their work. Yes. The conventions, it's like McDonald's, it's like a chain, you know what you're going to get. And that's why people love genre work. When they pick up a Western, they know what they're going to get. So it's like going to McDonald's and you know what your burger's going to taste like. Literary fiction, the focus is really very much on art, the art of writing. So it's much more elegantly written. It's character driven, and what that means is you have much more complex characters, more richly textured characters. Characters in a plot-driven novel can be kind of two-dimensional. They're just there because they serve moving the plot forward in some way, but they may not be highly developed. And then, so this high development of character, it's their personal motivations that move the story forward rather than a plot. Okay. So if you think of, famous short stories like Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. What drives that forward is, this grandmother and the misfit, and this tension between them that's almost impossible to describe and understand, but you have to look at the deep motivations of each of them.
So what is your next project? Will it be a novel or will it be short stories?
I am struggling with that. Okay. I definitely have a list. I have a short list. I think I'm moving towards a nonfiction book, and it's actually fairly highly developed.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think that's about all I can tell you about it right now.
Okay, that's all right. We'll talk later?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk after the cameras are off. That's great. I hear you're doing something sort of innovative on your website, a serialized blog. What the heck is a serialized blog? Tell me more about it.
Well, I was very involved in the conservation easement program here in Colorado. And over the last 11 years, this program has really gotten embroiled in a lot of scandal, and it's been very upsetting to a lot of landowners. These landowners have not received justice yet, and it's a very disturbing story. And as I went through the pain of experiencing this myself, and then kind of got through it and got to the other side, but looked at 300 to 600 landowners that still are struggling with this issue. And I thought, somebody needs to tell their story. It's been in the newspapers, but unfortunately, it's so complex. It's so complex that the newspapers can't really lay out the whole story. And I just felt an obligation. I said, out of all these landowners, I'm a writer. I can tell this story. I lived through it. And so I looked at possibly doing a book about it, but because it's pretty arcane, I just didn't think that the readership would be there. I wasn't sure the book would sell. And I'm doing this for the landowners, really. I'm doing it for landowners, but I'm also doing it for researchers, historians, newspaper reporters. So there's a lot of data in there. I link to a lot of historical documents. When I say historical, I mean recent history, but documents associated, documents that should be read and reviewed. And so I tell my story, but instead of a blog being focused on a topic and then blogging about a separate topic the next time, it's a story that could have been a book. And so all I did was serialize it. So I started in June. I wrote about 20 posts before I posted them, just to make sure I always had one ready.
Good.
I've posted 27 now. I have about 10 more to go to close out that story. So I would say by January I will have those all posted. And then I hope it will open up to maybe commentary, maybe stories of some of these landowners and so on. I'm very excited about it. I'm very excited about the response I'm getting and the meaning. It means something to people.
The serialized blog sounds fabulous and interesting to visit your website. What else can we find whenever we visit your website, Sharon?
I have an events page, so it shows events that I'll be attending, book signings and so on, or other interesting writing events that are going on in the Denver area. I also have links to my favorite bloggers, other important connections, information about where to buy these books. There's background on every book I've written, and so I hope it is a rich site for people.
It is. It's chock full of stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much for being on the show.
And thanks for all you do.
And sharing all these things you've got with us.
A lot going on.
Really appreciate it. And we'll be watching for your next adventures on your website.
Thank you so much.
You bet. I'd like to thank my author on today's show, Sharon Karen Mann. Her book, Tessera, you can find in your local library along with all these other great books. So join us for more next time on Off the Page.